Chapter 1. Russell's World. Russel Bradford believed there were two kinds of people in the world. Those who measured twice and cut once, and those who eyeballed everything and prayed for the best. He was firmly in the first camp, at least when he was working. Off the clock, all bets were off. The rhythmic hum of the planer filled the workshop behind his house, mingling with the faint scent of pine and walnut. Russell leaned over the plank, guiding it with steady hands, his breath puffing in the cold air. December had settled over Bradford Falls like a thick quilt, and the workshop's single space heater was losing the battle against winter. He didn't mind. The chill reminded him of camping trips, of mornings when frost clung to tent flaps and coffee tasted like salvation. He switched off the planer and inspected the wood grain, running his thumb along the smooth surface. Perfect. His father would approve. Not that approval was hard to earn when you were working for Bradford and Sons, a business older than most of the town. Started by Tiberius Bradford in 1894, the shop had survived wars, recessions, and the occasional family feud. Russell liked to joke that the only thing sturdier than their furniture was the Bradford stubborn streak. At 34, Russell had carved out his place in the family legacy. He was good at what he did, better than good if you asked the locals who swore by his craftsmanship. But what he loved most wasn't the commissions or the polished showroom pieces. It was the teaching. The Saturdays spent with a gaggle of scouts, their faces lit up like Christmas morning as they handled power tools for the first time. Kids didn't care about dovetail joints or wood grain. They cared about the thrill, the buzz of a sander, the satisfying thunk of a hammer. And Russell? He cared about the spark in their eyes when they realized they could make something with their own two hands. He wiped his hands on a rag and glanced at the calendar pinned to the wall. December 10th. 2 weeks until Christmas. 2 weeks until the troop's big project deadline. He grinned, imagining the chaos that awaited him. Shelves, jewelry boxes, cup holders. Half of them destined to be slightly crooked but made with love. That was the point. Russell hung up his apron and stepped outside, boots crunching on the frosted ground. Bradford Falls was the kind of town that looked like it had been designed for Christmas postcards. Victorian houses strung with lights, wreaths on every door, and a downtown square dominated by a tree so big it made the mayor nervous about the electric bill. Russell loved it. Loved the way the air smelled of pine and cinnamon. Loved the carolers who showed up uninvited and sang like they were auditioning for Broadway. He even loved the snow, though it made hauling lumber a workout. His phone buzzed in his pocket. A text from his dad. "Need you at the shop tomorrow." Big order came in. Russell typed back a quick "got it" and slid the phone away. Tomorrow was for business. Tonight was for planning the scout project, and maybe figuring out how to keep the troop from turning the workshop into a war zone. He climbed into his truck, the old Ford that had seen more camping trips than oil changes, and headed toward the church hall where the scouts met. The heater wheezed to life, and Russell drummed his fingers on the steering wheel, humming along to a Christmas song on the radio. He wasn't sure if he believed in fate, but if he did, he'd say December had a way of stirring things up. People fell in love, reconciled, made promises under twinkling lights. Not that Russell was looking for any of that. His life was simple and he liked it that way. Mostly. The hall was buzzing when he arrived. Scouts darted between tables, their uniforms slightly askew, voices overlapping in a chorus of excitement. Russell clapped his hands, and the room fell into a semblance of order. Scout code for mild chaos. "All right, troops," he said, grinning as a dozen faces turned toward him. "This year we're doing something special. You're making Christmas gifts for your parents. Real gifts. Handmade. No macaroni art." Groans and laughter rippled through the room. Russell held up a sample shelf he'd thrown together that afternoon. "Could be a shelf like this. Could be a jewelry box. Could be something else. You pick. But here's the deal, you build it. I'll help, but you're doing the work." The kids erupted with ideas. Bookends, spice racks, even a birdhouse from one ambitious soul. Russell jotted notes, offering tips and cracking jokes. It was the kind of chaos he thrived on. Then he noticed George. The boy sat at the edge of the group, shoulders hunched, eyes fixed on the floor. 13, quiet as snowfall, always polite but never quite part of the noise. Russell liked him. There was a steadiness in George, a kind of thoughtfulness rare in kids his age. But tonight, that steadiness looked more like defeat. Russell crouched beside him. "What's on your mind, partner?" George hesitated, then shrugged. "Don't know." "Come on," Russell coaxed. "You gotta have an idea. Something for your mom." Another shrug, but his voice was softer when he said, "I wanted to make her a coffee table, but I don't have enough money." Russell felt something twist in his chest. "Coffee table, huh? That's a big project." "She deserves something nice," George said, eyes still down. "Right now we've got boxes, with a sheet over them." Russell swallowed hard. He could picture it. The makeshift table, the quiet pride of a kid who wanted more for his mom. "Tell you what," he said, keeping his tone light. "Beautiful doesn't have to mean expensive. You and me will make it happen." George looked up, hope flickering like a candle. "Really? Really?" Russell said, grinning. "Law of the West. Man of the house learns to build." That earned him a small smile. The first real one Russell had seen. And just like that, the plan was set. Russell didn't know it yet, but that promise would change more than George's living room. It would change everything. Chapter 2. George's wish. Russell had always believed that the best ideas came when you weren't looking for them. Like finding a perfect piece of driftwood on a hike or stumbling across a diner that served pancakes the size of hubcaps. Tonight, though, the idea wasn't his. It belonged to George Tinsley, and it was about to turn Russell's December upside down. The church hall had emptied out, leaving behind the faint smell of hot cocoa and the echo of laughter. Russell stacked chairs with the efficiency of a man who'd done it 1,000 times, but his mind was on the quiet kid who'd slipped out with a polite nod and a backpack slung over one shoulder. A coffee table. Not just any coffee table, a gift for his mom. Russell could still hear the way George said it, like the words were heavy in his mouth. She deserves something nice. That wasn't just a project. That was a mission. Russell tossed the last chair onto the stack and grabbed his jacket. Outside, snowflakes drifted lazily under the glow of streetlights, settling on the windshield of his truck like powdered sugar. He climbed in, cranked the heat, and sat for a moment, drumming his fingers on the steering wheel. He could make this happen. He would make this happen. But first, he needed a plan, and some wood that didn't cost a fortune. The next afternoon, Russell found George waiting by the workshop, hands shoved deep into his coat pockets, breath puffing in the cold. The boy looked smaller than usual, swallowed by a navy parka that had seen better days. Russell grinned as he stepped out of the truck. "Ready to make history?" he called. George's mouth twitched like he wanted to smile but wasn't sure if it was allowed. "I guess." Russell clapped him on the shoulder. "That's the spirit. Come on, partner. First stop, lumber." George frowned. "I told you, I don't have." Russell held up a hand. "Relax. I've got a plan. And it doesn't involve you spending a dime." 10 minutes later, they were pulling into the loading dock of a big box hardware store, the kind of place where Christmas trees stood next to power drills and holiday music played over the hum of forklifts. Russell parked near a stack of wooden pallets and hopped out, motioning for George to follow. "Here's the deal," Russell said, lowering his voice like they were about to rob a bank. "These pallets? Gold mine. Solid wood. Just needs a little love." George stared at the rough planks, skepticism written all over his face. "That's garbage." Russell grinned. "Nah, that's opportunity wearing a bad outfit." Before George could reply, a burly guy in a neon vest approached, wiping his hands on a rag. Russell launched into his charm offensive, explaining the project, the scouts, the Christmas surprise. By the time he finished, the dock worker was grinning like Santa himself. "Take as many as you need," the guy said, clapping Russell on the back. "Kid's got a good heart." George flushed crimson as Russell loaded the truck bed with pallets, the dock crew cheering like they just witnessed a touchdown. When Russell glanced at George, the boy was trying, and failing, to hide a smile. "See," Russell said as they climbed back into the truck. "Law of the West. Ask nice, ride off with the loot." George shook his head, but the smile lingered. "You're weird." Russell laughed. "You're just figuring that out." Back at the workshop, Russell threw open the doors and gestured like a magician revealing his stage. "Welcome to the Bradford School of Carpentry. Tuition. One promise to wear safety goggles." George stepped inside, eyes widening at the rows of tools, the scent of sawdust, the workbench scarred from years of projects. Russell loved this moment. The awe, the spark. It was why he taught. "First lesson," Russell said, tossing George a pair of goggles. "Disassemble those pallets. We reclaim the wood, we save money, and we keep you from getting splinters the size of toothpicks." George eyed the crowbar Russell handed him. "What if I mess up?" Russell shrugged. "Then we fix it. That's the beauty of wood. It forgives." For the next hour, the workshop rang with the sound of nails squealing free, boards clattering onto the floor. Russell worked alongside George, cracking jokes, telling stories about his own scout days, like the time he tried to build a canoe and ended up with something that looked like a salad bowl. George laughed, a real laugh this time, and Russell felt a quiet satisfaction settle in his chest. The kid was loosening up. That was half the battle. When the last pallet was stripped, Russell wiped his hands and surveyed the pile of planks. "Not bad, partner. Tomorrow, we start turning this into something your mom's gonna love." George hesitated, then said softly, "Thanks, for, you know." Russell met his gaze, serious now. "You don't have to thank me. You're doing the work. I'm just here to make sure you don't cut off a finger." That earned him another smile, small, but steady. And for Russell, it was enough. Later, after George had gone and the workshop was quiet again, Russell stood staring at the reclaimed wood, plans forming in his mind. A modern design, clean lines, storage space, maybe even a little flair. Something that said thoughtful without screaming expensive. He could see it already, stained deep walnut, polished to a shine. He didn't know why this mattered so much. Maybe because George reminded him of himself at 13, trying to prove something, trying to make life better for someone who deserved it. Or maybe because, somewhere in the back of his mind, he was curious about the woman who'd raised a kid like that. Janet Tinsley. He'd seen her once or twice at scout meetings. Warm smile, tired eyes, the kind of presence that filled a room without trying. Russell shook his head, pushing the thought aside. This wasn't about her. It was about George. Still, as he locked up the workshop and stepped into the crisp night air, Russell couldn't help wondering what Christmas morning would look like in the Tinsley house, and why the idea made his chest feel strangely tight. Chapter 3. Sawdust and Secrets. Russell believed in two things when it came to woodworking: patience and good music. The first kept you from ruining a project. The second kept you sane while sanding for hours. Today, the workshop pulsed with both. Christmas tunes spilling from an old radio while Russell and George tackled the first real step of their mission. The reclaimed pallet boards lay stacked like soldiers awaiting orders. Russell tapped the top plank with a pencil. "All right, partner. Today we turn this pile of lumber into something that doesn't look like it came from behind a dumpster." George smirked, adjusting his safety goggles. "Sounds easy." Russell grinned. "That's the spirit. First rule: measure twice, cut once. Second rule: if you ignore the first rule, don't cry when your table looks like a Picasso." George laughed, quiet but genuine, and Russell felt that same flicker of satisfaction he'd felt yesterday. The kid was loosening up, and that mattered. They worked side by side, Russell guiding George through the basics: how to square a corner, how to read the grain, how to keep fingers far away from spinning blades. George listened intently, his brow furrowed in concentration, his hands steady even when the saw roared to life. "Nice cut," Russell said as George finished his first board. "Straight as an arrow." George shrugged, but his cheeks flushed with pride. "Guess I'm not terrible." Russell winked. "You're practically a legend already. Next week, we'll start signing autographs." George rolled his eyes, but Russell caught the smile tugging at his mouth. Progress. By mid-afternoon, the workshop smelled like sawdust and ambition. Planks were planed smooth, edges sanded, and Russell had sketched out the design on a sheet of paper. A sleek coffee table with storage, clean lines, and a little flair. George studied the drawing like it was a treasure map. "You think we can really make this?" Russell leaned against the workbench, arms crossed. "We're not just gonna make it. We're gonna make it so good your mom will think you robbed a furniture store." George snorted. "She'd probably believe that." Russell chuckled, then sobered as he noticed the way George's expression softened at the mention of his mom. There was love there, big, quiet love that didn't need words. Russell felt it like a weight in the room, and it made him want to work twice as hard. "Tell me about her," Russell said casually, picking up a sanding block. George hesitated, then shrugged. "She's tired a lot. Works 2 jobs. Still makes time for me, though. We watch movies on weekends. She likes old ones. Black and white stuff." Russell smiled. "Classy." "Yeah." George's voice dropped. "She deserves something nice." Russell nodded, throat tight. "Then let's give her something nice." They were cleaning up when Russell heard the crunch of tires on snow outside. He glanced through the window and froze. A silver sedan had pulled into the driveway, and out stepped a woman bundled in a wool coat, her auburn hair catching the pale winter light. Janet Tinsley. Russell's pulse did something weird, like a hammer skipping on a nail. He hadn't expected her. Not today. Not with sawdust in his hair and a workshop that looked like a lumberyard exploded. George noticed too. That's my mom." Russell muttered something that might have been a prayer and wiped his hands on a rag. "Guess we're about to meet the boss." Janet approached, her boots crunching softly, her breath visible in the cold. Up close, Russell saw details he'd missed before. The faint lines of fatigue around her eyes, the quick, assessing glance she gave the workshop, and, unexpectedly, the warmth in her smile. "Hi," she said, voice smooth as polished oak. "I hope I'm not interrupting." Russell shook his head, suddenly aware of the sawdust clinging to his flannel. "Not at all. Just teaching George the fine art of not losing a finger." Janet's lips curved. "Sounds important." George groaned softly. "Mom." Russell grinned, sensing an opportunity for mischief. "He's a natural. Might have to hire him full-time." Janet laughed, a soft, genuine sound that made Russell's chest feel oddly light. "Please don't. I need him for homework." Russell spread his hands in mock surrender. "Fair enough. But if he starts building castles, I'm taking credit." Janet shook her head, amused, then glanced at the pile of wood. "So, what exactly are you two working on?" Russell opened his mouth, then shut it. He couldn't ruin the surprise, not after all the effort George had put in. Time for a little creative misdirection. "Secret project," he said solemnly. "Scout's honor." Janet raised a brow. "Secret, huh?" "Top secret," Russell confirmed. "If I told you, I'd have to make you sign a non-disclosure agreement." George groaned louder. "He's weird." Janet laughed again, and Russell felt something shift, like the air had gotten warmer despite the snow. He liked that laugh. He liked the way her eyes crinkled when she smiled. He liked, well, more than he should probably admit. She stayed only a few minutes, long enough to thank Russell for whatever this is, and to remind George about dinner. As she walked back to the car, Russell watched her go, his mind buzzing like a saw blade. He told himself it was nothing, just a mom checking on her kid, just a laugh that lingered longer than it should. But as the taillights disappeared down the road, Russell knew one thing for sure. This Christmas was about to get complicated. Chapter 4. Misdirection and Midnight Blue. Janet Tinsley was not a suspicious woman by nature. She was practical, organized, and far too busy juggling two jobs to indulge in wild theories. But something was up with her son, and Janet intended to find out what. George had been humming Christmas songs. Humming. This was a boy who treated joy like a rare currency, and suddenly he was spending it like a billionaire. He'd been smiling more, too. Real smiles, not the polite ones he wore like armor. And then there was the workshop visit yesterday, where Russel Bradford had greeted her with sawdust in his hair and a grin that could melt an icicle. Janet shook her head as she stirred a pot of chili, the scent filling their modest kitchen. She wasn't blind. Russell was, well, handsome. In that rugged, flannel-wearing, could-build a house with his bare hands kind of way. But Janet didn't have time for handsome. She had bills, deadlines, and a teenager who needed her to keep the world spinning. Still, curiosity gnawed at her. What were they building? Why all the secrecy? And why did Russell's smile linger in her mind like the echo of a song? Meanwhile, in the workshop, Russell was knee-deep in sawdust and strategy. George had taken to woodworking like a duck to water, or at least like a duck to a pond with a few speed bumps. He was careful, methodical, and surprisingly good at dovetail joints for a kid who'd never touched a chisel before. "Nice work," Russell said as George fitted two pieces together. "That's tighter than my jeans after Thanksgiving." George snorted. "You're weird." "Thank you," Russell said solemnly. "I take that as a compliment." They worked in companionable silence for a while, the radio crooning Bing Crosby in the background. Russell kept one eye on the clock. Janet had mentioned dinner yesterday, and he didn't want George late. Not that he minded the idea of Janet showing up again. He didn't mind that at all. When the frame was assembled, Russell pulled out a roll of midnight blue felt and laid it on the bench. George's eyes widened. "Whoa, that's fancy." Russell grinned. "Extra material from another project. Thought we'd line the storage compartment. Give it some class." George ran his fingers over the fabric. "Reverent. She's gonna love this." Russell felt a lump in his throat. "Yeah, kid. She is." Later, as George packed up, Russell decided to test the waters. "Your mom seemed nice yesterday." George shrugged, but there was a flicker of something. Pride. Maybe. In his eyes. "She is." Russell nodded, casual. "She always that good at interrogation?" George smirked. "She's better when she wants to be." Russell laughed. "Noted. Guess I'll have to keep my secrets locked up." George hesitated, then said, "She thinks you're weird." Russell grinned. "Excellent. Weird is memorable." George rolled his eyes, but Russell caught the hint of a smile before the kid headed out into the cold. That night, Russell sat at his kitchen table, sketching final details for the coffee table. His pencil moved almost on its own, but his mind kept drifting, to Janet's laugh, to the way her eyes crinkled when she smiled, to the quiet strength in her voice. He told himself it was nothing, just a passing thought. But when he imagined Christmas morning, the look on her face when she saw what George had made, Russell felt something stir deep in his chest. Something he hadn't felt in a long time. And for the first time in years, Russel Bradford wondered if this Christmas might hold more than sawdust and scout projects. Chapter 5. The Art of Distraction. Janet Tinsley prided herself on being reasonable. She didn't leap to conclusions, didn't indulge in gossip, and certainly didn't let her imagination run wild. But after 3 days of watching her son leave the house with a grin and return smelling faintly of sawdust, Janet was starting to feel like a detective in a cozy mystery. Minus the tea and the cat. She tried subtle questions first. "How was Scouts? What did you do today?" George's answers were vague enough to make her suspicious. "Stuff. Projects. Russell says hi." That last one came with a shrug so casual it was practically a confession. Janet stirred sugar into her coffee, staring out the kitchen window at the frost creeping along the glass. She wasn't worried. Russel Bradford had a solid reputation in town. Good family, good business, the kind of man who could probably build a rocking chair blindfolded. But still, what was he doing with George that had her son humming Christmas carols like he'd swallowed a radio? She decided to find out. Russell was in the workshop, whistling along to Jingle Bell Rock, while he tightened the hinges on the coffee table's storage lid. The project was coming together beautifully. Sleek lines, deep walnut stain, and that midnight blue felt lining that made the inside look like a jewelry box for giants. George was sanding the legs nearby, his movements steady, his expression focused. "Looking good," Russell said, giving the hinge a final twist. "This thing's gonna survive an earthquake." George grinned. "Mom's gonna freak out." Russell chuckled. "In a good way, I hope." Before George could reply, the crunch of tires on snow made Russell glance toward the window. His stomach did a weird flip when he saw the silver sedan. "Oh," Russell muttered. "Incoming." George looked up. "Mom." Russell nodded, wiping his hands on a rag. "Time to deploy Operation Misdirection." George groaned. "You're so weird." Russell winked. "Weird is my superpower." Janet stepped into the workshop, her boots leaving neat prints in the snow. She paused in the doorway, taking in the scene. Russell in his flannel, sleeves rolled up, sawdust dusting his hair like frost. George standing proud beside a half-finished table that looked far too sophisticated for a scout project. "Well," Janet said, her voice warm but edged with curiosity. "This doesn't look like birdhouses." Russell flashed his most innocent grin. "Birdhouses are overrated. We're working on advanced carpentry skills." Janet raised a brow. "Advanced?" "Absolutely," Russell said, leaning casually against the workbench. "By the time we're done, George will be able to build a log cabin. Or at least a very sturdy lemonade stand." George snorted. "He's kidding." Janet's lips curved. "I figured." Russell caught the glint of amusement in her eyes and felt something spark, like the moment a match flares to life. He liked that look. He liked the way she stood there, confident and curious, like she belonged in the space even though she clearly didn't. "So," Janet said, stepping closer, "what's the real story?" Russell spread his hands in mock surrender. "Scout's honor. I can't tell you. Classified information." Janet tilted her head, her auburn hair catching the light. "Classified. Top secret," Russell said solemnly. "If I told you, I'd have to make you sign a non-disclosure agreement and possibly teach you how to use a lathe." Janet laughed, a soft, genuine sound that made Russell's chest feel oddly warm. "You're impossible." Russell grinned. "I prefer mysterious. Sounds cooler." George groaned. "Can we not?" Janet shook her head, amused, then glanced at her son. "You look happy." George shrugged, but his smile gave him away. "It's fun." Janet's gaze softened, and Russell saw something flicker there. Gratitude? Maybe, or relief. It made him want to say something reassuring, something that would tell her this wasn't just about wood and nails. But before he could, Janet checked her watch. "I should let you finish," she said. "Dinner's waiting." Russell nodded, resisting the urge to ask her to stay. "We'll wrap up soon." As she walked back to the car, Russell watched her go, his mind buzzing like a saw blade. He told himself it was nothing, just a mom checking on her kid, just a laugh that lingered longer than it should. But when the taillights disappeared down the road, Russell knew one thing for sure. Keeping this project a secret was getting harder by the day. Chapter 6. Confidence and Complications. Russel Bradford had seen a lot of transformations in his years as a scout leader. Shy kids finding their voice, restless ones learning patience. But watching Janet Tinsley change was something else entirely. The boy who once hovered at the edge of every conversation now stood at the workbench like he owned it, sanding the coffee table legs with the precision of a craftsman. "Not bad," Russell said, leaning over to inspect the smooth surface. "You keep this up, I'll have to start charging you rent." George smirked, a rare flash of humor. "You'd have to pay me first." Russell laughed, the sound echoing off the workshop walls. "Touché." The table was nearly complete now. Frame assembled, hinges installed, storage compartment lined with that midnight blue felt that made Russell absurdly proud. All that remained was the finish. Stain, seal, and polish until the wood gleamed like something out of a catalog. Russell handed George a brush and a can of walnut stain. Moment of truth. "You ready?" George nodded, his expression serious. "Yeah." Russell watched as the boy dipped the brush and began applying the stain in smooth, even strokes. The rich color seeped into the grain, transforming the pale wood into something warm and elegant. Russell felt a swell of pride, not just for the table, but for the kid who was making it happen. "You know," Russell said casually, "you've got a knack for this." George shrugged, but his cheeks flushed. "It's fun." Russell smiled. "Fun's a good start. Skill comes next. Confidence after that." George glanced up, his eyes bright. "You think my mom's gonna like it?" Russell met his gaze, no hesitation. "She's gonna love it." Later, after George had gone and the workshop was quiet, Russell lingered by the finished table, running his fingers over the smooth surface. It was beautiful, better than he'd imagined when he first sketched the design. But what struck him most wasn't the craftsmanship. It was the thought behind it. George hadn't just built a piece of furniture. He'd built a gesture, a promise, a way of saying "I see you. I appreciate you." Russell exhaled slowly, his breath fogging in the cold air. He thought about Janet, the woman who worked 2 jobs, who still found time for movie nights, who smiled like she meant it even when life was heavy. He pictured her walking into the living room on Christmas morning, seeing this table, realizing what her son had done. And for reasons Russell couldn't quite name, the image made his chest ache in a way that was both unfamiliar and not unpleasant. The next day, Russell stopped by the hardware store for a few finishing supplies. As he waited in line, he caught himself scanning the crowd, half hoping to see Janet. He didn't. Instead, he found himself wondering what he'd say if he did. "Hi, just buying stain for the secret project your son and I are working on. Also, you have a laugh that makes me forget my own name." "Yeah, that would go over well." Russell shook his head, chuckling under his breath. He wasn't looking for anything. His life was simple and he liked it that way. But as he drove home, the thought lingered like the scent of fresh-cut pine. Maybe simple wasn't enough anymore. That evening, Russell texted George to confirm their next session. The reply came quickly. "Can we finish tomorrow?" Mom's working late. I want it done before Christmas. Russell smiled at the urgency in those words. The kid was invested now, really invested. And Russell? He was all in too. As he set the supplies on the workbench, Russell glanced at the calendar pinned to the wall. December 22nd. 3 days until Christmas. 3 days until the big reveal. 3 days until what exactly? Russell didn't know. But he had a feeling this Christmas was going to change more than George's living room. Chapter 7. Aisles and Awkwardness. Russell Bradford had a simple plan. Run into the hardware store, grab a few LED strips for the coffee table's finishing touch, and get out before the holiday rush swallowed him whole. What he didn't plan on was fate, or whatever you call it when the universe decides to throw a curveball in the form of Janet Tinsley. The store was packed with last-minute shoppers hunting for extension cords and inflatable snowmen. Russell navigated the chaos like a seasoned pro, weaving past carts piled high with garland and boxes of lights. He was halfway down the electrical aisle when he heard a voice behind him. Russell! He turned, and there she was, Janet, in a deep green coat that made her auburn hair look like fire against the fluorescent lights. She held a small basket, her expression a mix of surprise and something else Russell couldn't quite name. Janet, he said, his grin automatic. Fancy seeing you here. Stocking up for the apocalypse. She laughed, and Russell felt that now familiar warmth spread through his chest. Just light bulbs, she said, holding up the box. One burned out in the kitchen. I figured I'd replace it before we start eating dinner by candlelight. Romantic, Russell teased. But dangerous. Open flames and spaghetti don't mix. Janet shook her head, amused. What about you? Planning to light up the neighborhood? Russell held up the LED strip in his hand, then hesitated. He couldn't exactly say for the secret coffee table your son and I are building. Time for another round of creative misdirection. Holiday project, he said vaguely. Trying to make something glow. Janet raised a brow. Glow? Russell nodded solemnly. It's very high-tech. Might involve lasers. She laughed again, and Russell decided he liked that sound more than any Christmas carol. You're impossible, she said, shaking her head. I prefer innovative, Russell replied, leaning casually against the shelf. Sounds cooler. Janet gave him a look, half amused, half curious, and Russell felt the air shift, just a little. There was something in her eyes, something warm and sharp all at once, and it made his pulse do that weird skip again. So, she said, tilting her head, are you always this cryptic? Russell grinned. Only when I'm trying to keep a scout's secret. Janet's lips curved. Ah, classified information. Top secret, Russell confirmed. If I told you, I'd have to teach you how to use a table saw. Janet laughed and Russell caught himself staring. At the way her eyes crinkled, at the way her hair brushed her collar, at the way she seemed to light up the dull aisle like a string of Christmas lights. He looked away quickly, pretending to study a box of screws. Well, Janet said after a moment, I should let you get back to glowing things. Russell nodded, resisting the urge to ask her to stay, to grab coffee, to do anything that would keep this conversation going. See you around. Janet smiled, and Russell felt that smile like a spark. Probably, she said, and then she was gone, weaving through the crowd with effortless grace. Russell stood there for a long moment, staring at the LED strip in his hand, his mind buzzing louder than the holiday music overhead. He told himself it was nothing, just a chance meeting, just a laugh that lingered longer than it should. But as he headed for the checkout, Russell knew one thing for sure. This Christmas was getting complicated in ways he hadn't planned. Chapter 8. The final touch. Russell Bradford believed there was magic in the last step of any project. Not the cutting or the sanding, that was skill. Not the assembly, that was patience. No, the magic came when you wiped on the stain, brushed on the finish, and watched raw wood transform into something that looked like it belonged in a glossy magazine. Today, that magic was happening in his workshop. The coffee table stood proudly in the center of the room, its deep walnut stain gleaming under the overhead lights. The storage compartment opened smoothly, revealing the midnight blue felt lining that looked like velvet in the glow of the LED strip Russell had installed around the base. When the lights clicked on, the table didn't just shine. It glowed, soft and warm, like something out of a designer showroom. George stared at it wide-eyed, his hands hovering as if afraid to touch. It's perfect. Russell grinned, wiping his hands on a rag. Not bad for a couple of guys working with pallet wood, huh? George shook his head slowly, all written all over his face. She's gonna freak out. Russell chuckled, though his chest felt tight in a way he couldn't explain. Yeah, kid. She is. They spent the next hour applying the final coat of enamel, sealing the wood against spills and scratches. Russell guided George through every step, but the boy hardly needed instruction now. His movements were confident, precise, the kind of confidence Russell had hoped to see from day one. When they finished, Russell stepped back and surveyed the table like an artist admiring a masterpiece. You did good, George. Real good. George's smile was shy but steady. Thanks for, everything. Russell clapped him on the shoulder. You earned it. This is your work. I just kept you from gluing your fingers together. George laughed, and Russell felt that flicker of pride again. Pride for the kid, for the project, for the fact that something so simple had turned into something that mattered. After George left, Russell lingered in the workshop, staring at the table. It wasn't just furniture. It was a story of effort, of care, of a boy who wanted to give his mom something beautiful because life hadn't given her enough. Russell thought about Janet, about the way her eyes softened when she looked at George, about the laugh that had stuck in his head since the hardware store. He imagined her walking into the living room on Christmas morning, seeing this table, realizing what her son had done. He imagined her smile, the real one, the one that reached her eyes. And that's when the ache hit him again, sharp and unexpected. He wasn't just proud of George. He wanted to be there. He wanted to see that moment, to share it. To what? Sit at that table and drink coffee with Janet while snow fell outside? Russell shook his head, trying to laugh it off, but the sound came out hollow. This wasn't about him. It was about George. About making Christmas special for a kid who deserved it. That was all. At least, that's what Russell told himself as he turned off the lights and locked the workshop door. Meanwhile, Janet Tinsley was starting to piece things together. Not the whole picture, just enough to know something big was brewing. George had been buzzing with energy all evening, practically vibrating as he set the table for dinner. He hummed under his breath, grinned at nothing, and even asked if they had any extra wrapping paper. Janet watched him, her curiosity sharpening like a blade. She'd seen the workshop, seen Russell's easy smile and evasive answers, and now her son was acting like he had the world's best secret. Janet didn't mind surprises. She loved them, actually. But she hated being in the dark when it came to George. She decided to wait. Christmas was only 2 days away. Whatever this was, she'd find out soon enough. Still, as she rinsed dishes and glanced out the window at the snow drifting down, Janet couldn't stop thinking about Russel Bradford, and the way his grin had made her forget, just for a moment, how tired she was. Chapter 9. Christmas Eve and close calls. Russel Bradford had survived plenty of high-pressure situations, scout jamborees and thunderstorms, last-minute furniture orders, even a raccoon invasion during a camping trip, but nothing compared to the stress of keeping Janet Tinsley from discovering the coffee table before Christmas morning. It was Christmas Eve, and the workshop smelled faintly of polish and pine. The table gleamed under the soft glow of the LED strip, every inch perfect. Russell had even tied a big red bow around it because if you're going to make a statement, you might as well go full Hallmark. George stood beside him, practically vibrating with excitement. She's going to lose her mind. Russell grinned. In a good way, I hope. George nodded, then frowned. You think she'll cry? Russell shrugged. Happy tears, maybe. That's allowed. George looked relieved, and Russell felt that familiar tug in his chest, the one that had been growing stronger every day. This wasn't just about a table. It was about a kid who wanted to give his mom something beautiful. And maybe, just maybe, it was about Russell wanting to be part of something more than sawdust and scout meetings. They loaded the table into Russell's truck under cover of darkness, like they were smuggling contraband. Snowflakes drifted lazily through the night, settling on the bow as Russell secured the straps. You ready? Russell asked. George nodded, his breath puffing in the cold. Let's do it. Janet was in the kitchen when they arrived, humming softly as she arranged cookies on a plate. Russell caught a glimpse of her through the window, hair pulled back, sleeves rolled up, looking so effortlessly beautiful it made his pulse skip. He shook himself. Focus. This was about the surprise. George slipped inside first, calling out, Mom, don't come in the living room. Janet turned, brows lifting. Why not? Just don't, George said, his voice cracking with urgency. Janet blinked, then laughed. Okay. Russell followed with the table, moving fast before she could peek. They set it in place, the bow gleaming like a crown. George fussed with the angle, making sure it was perfect, while Russell tried not to notice Janet leaning in the doorway, arms crossed, curiosity sparking in her eyes. What? She said slowly. Is going on? Russell flashed his most innocent grin. Scout business. Janet raised a brow. Scout business involves furniture? Russell shrugged. Sometimes. You'd be surprised. Janet shook her head, amused, but Russell saw the questions swirling behind her smile. He wanted to tell her, wanted to see her face light up, but George deserved the moment. So Russell held his tongue, even as Janet's gaze lingered on him a little longer than necessary. When the table was finally in place and George had declared it off-limits until morning, Russell headed for the door. Janet followed, pulling her coat tighter against the cold. Thank you, she said softly. Whatever this is, thank you. Russell met her eyes, and for a moment, the world narrowed to just the two of them. The snow falling, the glow of Christmas lights, the warmth in her voice. He wanted to say something clever, something that would make her laugh, but all that came out was, anytime. Janet smiled, and Russell felt that smile like a spark in his chest. Then she turned back toward the house, and Russell walked to his truck, his breath fogging in the night air. He told himself it was nothing, just a favor for a scout, just a laugh that lingered longer than it should. But as he drove away, Russell knew one thing for sure. Tomorrow wasn't just about George's surprise. It was about what came after, and he wasn't sure he was ready for how much he wanted that. Chapter 10. Christmas Morning Magic. Snow fell in lazy spirals outside the Tinsley house, frosting the world in white. Inside, the scent of cinnamon rolls mingled with the faint crackle of a Christmas playlist. Janet Tinsley stood in the kitchen, tying her robe tighter as she poured coffee, her mind buzzing with curiosity. George had been guarding the living room like a soldier since dawn, refusing to let her peek. Whatever the surprise was, it had him grinning like he'd won the lottery. "Can I look now?" Janet called, amused. "Not yet." George's voice floated down the hall, full of urgency. "Just give me a second." Janet shook her head, smiling as she sipped her coffee. She loved surprises, always had, but this one felt different, bigger. And if she was honest, part of her wondered if Russel Bradford had something to do with it. The thought made her pulse skip in a way she didn't care to examine. In the living room, George fussed with the bow on the coffee table, his hands trembling with excitement. Russell crouched beside him, adjusting the LED strip for maximum effect. The table gleamed under the soft glow, every inch perfect. Sleek walnut stain, polished enamel, midnight blue felt lining the storage compartment. It looked like something out of a designer catalog, not a scout project born from pallet wood. "You ready?" Russell asked quietly. George nodded, his grin so wide it could light up the tree. "Yeah." Russell straightened, his heart thudding harder than it should. This was George's moment, but somehow it felt like his too. "Okay, Mom," George called. "Come in." Janet set down her mug and walked toward the living room, her slippers whispering against the carpet. She stepped through the doorway and froze. The table sat in the center of the room like a jewel, the bow gleaming, the LED glow casting a soft halo. For a moment, Janet couldn't speak. She just stared, her breath catching, her hand flying to her mouth. "George." Her voice broke, and she tried again. You made this." George nodded, his cheeks flushed with pride. "With Russell. He taught me." Janet moved closer, her fingers trembling as she touched the smooth surface. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "It's perfect." George beamed. "No more boxes." Janet laughed through tears, pulling him into a hug so fierce Russell felt it from across the room. "Thank you," she murmured into her son's hair. "Thank you." Russell swallowed hard, his throat tight. He'd imagined this moment, but seeing Janet's eyes shine, seeing George stand tall with pride, it hit him like a hammer. He wanted to stay, wanted to be part of this warmth, this laughter, this family. But he wasn't sure if he belonged. Janet turned then, her gaze finding Russell. For a heartbeat, the room seemed to still. Snow fell outside, lights twinkled on the tree, and her smile, soft, grateful, radiant, made Russell forget how to breathe. "Thank you," she said, her voice low but steady. "For everything." Russell managed to grin, though his chest felt like it was carrying more than words. "Anytime." Janet's eyes held his for a moment longer than necessary, and Russell felt something shift, something quiet but undeniable. Then George tugged her toward the table, chattering about the storage compartment and the felt lining, and the spell broke. Russell stood there, hands shoved in his pockets, watching them laugh together. He told himself this was enough, helping George, seeing Janet smile. It was enough. But as he stepped outside into the crisp winter air, Russell knew the truth. He wanted more. And for the first time in years, he wondered if Christmas might just give it to him. Chapter 11. Dinner plans and dangerous chemistry. George Tinsley had never considered himself a mastermind, but as he watched his mom fuss over the new coffee table, wiping it down like it was made of gold, he realized he had leverage. Big leverage. And he intended to use it. "Mom," George said casually, leaning against the arm of the couch. "You should invite Russell for dinner." Janet froze mid-polish, her brows lifting. "Dinner?" "Yeah," George said, trying for nonchalance and landing somewhere near blatant scheming. "To thank him. He helped me. A lot." Janet hesitated, her fingers tracing the smooth walnut surface. She'd been thinking about Russell more than she cared to admit. His easy grin, his quick wit, the way he'd looked at her yesterday like she was more than just a tired mom in a wool coat. But inviting him? That felt complicated. "I don't know," she said slowly. "He probably has plans." George shrugged. "You could ask." Janet gave him a look, the kind that said she knew exactly what he was doing. But George held her gaze, steady and earnest. "He deserves it," he said softly. "For this." Janet's heart squeezed. Her son wasn't wrong. Russell had gone above and beyond, and Janet wasn't the kind of woman who let kindness go unacknowledged. Still, the idea of Russell sitting at her table, laughing in her kitchen, filling the quiet spaces of her home, it made her pulse skip in a way that had nothing to do with gratitude. "I'll think about it," she said, turning back to the table. George grinned. Step 1. Complete. Russell was halfway through a plate of leftover ham when his phone buzzed. He wiped his hands and checked the screen, and nearly choked on his coffee. Janet Tinsley. "Hi, Russell. George and I were wondering if you'd like to join us for Christmas dinner tomorrow. Just something simple. No pressure." Russell stared at the message, his heart thudding like a drum. Dinner. At Janet's house. On Christmas. He told himself to play it cool, to think it through, but his fingers were already typing before his brain caught up. Russell wouldn't miss it. What time? The reply came quickly, 5. And thank you, for everything. Russell set the phone down, his grin stretching so wide it hurt. He tried to tell himself this was just a thank you, nothing more. But deep down, he knew better. This wasn't just dinner. This was a door opening, and Russell wasn't sure he could walk through without wanting more. Christmas Day, 4:45 p.m. Russell stood on Janet's porch, a bottle of wine in one hand and a plate of homemade fudge in the other. He'd agonized over what to bring. Flowers felt too romantic, cookies too casual, before settling on something safe but thoughtful. Now, as he heard footsteps approaching the door, he wondered if he should have brought a parachute instead. Because if this went wrong, he was going to need an escape plan. The door opened, and there she was, Janet, in a deep red sweater that made her hair glow like copper in the soft light. Her smile was warm, her eyes bright, and Russell forgot how to breathe for a second. "Hi," she said, her voice smooth as polished oak. "Come in." Russell stepped inside, the scent of roasted turkey and cinnamon wrapping around him like a hug. The house was cozy, the tree twinkling in the corner, the coffee table gleaming like a crown jewel. George appeared from the kitchen, grinning like a kid who just pulled off the world's greatest heist. "Russell," he said, "you made it." Russell ruffled his hair. "Wouldn't miss it, partner." Janet took the wine and fudge, her fingers brushing his just long enough to send a spark racing up his arm. Russell told himself it was nothing, just static, just holiday cheer. But as he followed her into the kitchen, he knew the truth. This wasn't just dinner. This was the start of something, and Russell wasn't sure he was ready for how much he wanted that. Chapter 12. Dinner and Disasters. Russell Bradford had built tables sturdy enough to survive hurricanes, but nothing could have prepared him for the whirlwind that was Christmas dinner at Janet Tinsley's house. The evening started innocently enough. The turkey was golden, the mashed potatoes fluffy, and the coffee table gleamed like a crown jewel in the living room. Russell sat across from Janet, trying to look relaxed while his pulse thudded like a drum. George, of course, was grinning like a cat who'd swallowed the canary. "So," Janet said, passing the rolls, "how long have you been teaching woodworking?" Russell reached for the basket and promptly knocked over his water glass. It tipped in slow motion, spilling across the tablecloth like a tidal wave. Russell lunged for napkins, muttering, "Well, that's one way to make an impression." Janet laughed, her eyes sparkling. "Don't worry, it's just water." Russell dabbed at the mess, his ears burning. "Guess I should stick to wood. Less chance of flooding." George snorted. "You're clumsy." Russell shot him a look. "You're supposed to have my back, partner." George grinned. "Not tonight." Janet shook her head, amused, and Russell felt that laugh like a spark in his chest. He wanted to bottle it, keep it, hear it again and again. Dinner continued with fewer disasters, at least until Russell tried to carve the turkey. Janet handed him the knife with a smile that said, "Be my guest," and Russell, eager to impress, launched into a scout story about wilderness survival while slicing. "And then," he said, gesturing with the knife, "the raccoon." The knife slipped, sending a chunk of turkey flying across the table like a rogue snowball. It landed on George's plate with a splat. Russell froze. Bonus serving?" George howled with laughter, and Janet covered her mouth, her shoulders shaking. Russell grinned sheepishly. "Guess I'm better with dovetail joints." Janet's eyes danced. "I'll take your word for it." As the evening wore on, the chaos mellowed into warmth. They lingered over dessert, Russell's homemade fudge earning rave reviews, and traded stories about Christmas traditions. Janet talked about old black and white movies, her voice soft with nostalgia. Russell listened, captivated, watching the way her eyes lit up when she spoke. "You really love those classics," he said. Janet smiled. "They remind me that happy endings exist." Russell felt something shift inside him. Quiet, deep, undeniable. He wanted to give her that. A happy ending. Or at least a happy beginning. When the plates were cleared and the coffee brewed, Russell found himself standing by the coffee table, tracing the smooth walnut surface. "You know," he said softly, "George did most of this." Janet joined him, her fingers brushing the edge. "It's beautiful," she murmured. "Thank you for helping him." Russell met her gaze, and for a moment, the world narrowed to just the two of them. The glow of Christmas lights, the scent of cinnamon, the hum of laughter in the background. He wanted to say something real, something that mattered, but George barreled in, holding a plate of cookies like a peace offering. "Dessert round 2, he announced. Janet laughed, and the spell broke. Russell smiled, but inside, he knew one thing for sure. Tonight had changed everything. And tomorrow might change even more. Chapter 13. A promise in the quiet. The house had settled into that soft hush that only comes after a long, laughter-filled evening. The dishes were done, the lights on the tree twinkled like tiny stars, and George had retreated to his room with a plate of cookies and the smug satisfaction of a kid who'd pulled off the perfect Christmas surprise. Russell stood by the door, his coat draped over one arm, trying to convince himself it was time to leave. He'd stayed longer than planned, helped with cleanup, swapped stories, even endured George's relentless teasing about turkey mishaps. But now, as Janet walked back into the living room, her hair loose around her shoulders, her smile soft and tired and beautiful, Russell felt his resolve falter. "Thanks for coming," she said, her voice low, warm. "And for everything." Russell met her gaze, and for a moment, the world outside, the snow, the cold, the ticking clock, ceased to exist. "Any time," he said, and meant it more than he'd ever meant anything. Janet stepped closer, her fingers brushing the edge of the coffee table. "You didn't have to do all this." Russell shook his head. "Yeah, I did." She looked up, surprise flickering in her eyes. Russell swallowed hard, searching for words that didn't sound like a line from a movie. "George, he's a good kid. He wanted to give you something special. I just wanted to help him do that." Janet's smile deepened, but there was something else now, something quiet and tender that made Russell's chest ache. "You did more than help," she said softly. "You gave him confidence. You gave him joy." Russell felt the weight of her words settle in his bones. He wanted to tell her how much that mattered to him, how much she mattered to him, even if he'd only begun to admit it to himself. Instead, he said the simplest truth he could find. "I like being around him," Russell said. Then, after a beat, "And I like being around you." Janet's breath caught, just slightly, and Russell saw it. The spark, the shift, the unspoken answer in her eyes. For a heartbeat, the air between them hummed like a live wire. Then Janet smiled. A slow, genuine smile that made Russell feel like the ground beneath him had turned to something steady and sure. "I like that too," she said. Russell exhaled, a laugh slipping out, soft and relieved. "Good," he murmured, "because I was starting to think I'd have to build another coffee table just to get invited back." Janet laughed, the sound warm and bright, and Russell felt it wrap around him like the glow of Christmas lights. "No need," she said. "You're welcome here anytime." Russell nodded, his grin stretching wide, his heart thudding like a hammer. He reached for his coat, but before he left, he paused at the door, turning back to her. "Merry Christmas, Janet." "Merry Christmas, Russell," she said, her voice soft as falling snow. And as Russell stepped out into the crisp night air, the world glittering under a blanket of white, he knew one thing for certain. This wasn't the end of a story. It was the beginning, messy, unpredictable, and full of promise. The kind of promise that made him believe, for the first time in years, that happy endings weren't just for old movies. Epilogue. Sawdust and snowflakes. Bradford Falls was still wrapped in winter when Russell pulled into Janet's driveway 2 weeks after Christmas. The snow had softened into glittering drifts, and the coffee table, George's masterpiece, sat proudly in the living room, now adorned with a vase of fresh flowers and a stack of old black and white movie DVDs. Russell knocked, and the door opened to Janet's smile, the kind that made the cold vanish in an instant. George barreled past her, waving a flyer. "Russell, the troop's planning a winter campout. You're coming, right?" Russell laughed. "Wouldn't miss it." Janet shook her head, amused. "You two and your adventures." Russell grinned, his eyes meeting hers. "Speaking of adventures, I was wondering if you'd like to join me for one. Nothing crazy, just coffee. Maybe dinner. No power tools involved." Janet's brows lifted, but her smile softened into something that made Russell's heart thud. "I think I'd like that." George groaned dramatically. "Great. Now I have to share him." Russell chuckled, ruffling the boy's hair. "Don't worry, partner. You'll always be my #1 scout." Janet laughed, and Russell felt the sound wrap around him like the glow of Christmas lights. As he stepped inside, snowflakes drifting past the window, Russell realized something simple and certain. This wasn't just a happy ending. It was the start of a new chapter, one built on laughter, trust, and maybe a little sawdust. And for the first time in years, Russell Bradford couldn't wait to see where the story went.